The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete pathways of Riverside Military Academy as students hurry to their first classes. Among the sea of perfectly pressed uniforms and polished boots, one figure stood out like a question mark in a sentence of certainties. Sarah Chen walked slowly through the academy gates, her oversized uniform hanging loosely on her small frame, her black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that somehow looked too casual for this place of rigid discipline. She clutched a worn leather messenger bag against her chest, her dark eyes scanning the imposing brick buildings that would be her home for the next year. Everything about this place screamed authority and tradition. The American flag snapped proudly in the morning breeze above the main building, while smaller flags representing different military branches lined the walkway like silent sentinels. "Look at that," whispered Marcus Rodriguez to his friend Jake Thompson as they watched Sarah struggle with a map near the main entrance. "Another rich daddy's girl who thinks military school is going to be like summer camp." Jake smirked, adjusting his perfectly knotted tie. "Give her a week. She'll be crying for mommy and daddy to come pick her up." Marcus and Jake were seniors at Riverside, both holding positions of respect among their peers. Marcus wore the stripes of a cadet sergeant, while Jake proudly displayed his role as company commander. They had earned their positions through 3 years of hard work, dedication, and the kind of military bearing that impressed both faculty and fellow students. To them, Sarah represented everything they had worked to rise above: weakness, uncertainty, and a lack of commitment to the military way of life. As Sarah finally found her way to the main building, she could feel dozens of eyes following her every move. The whispers started almost immediately, carried on the morning air like autumn leaves rustling in the wind. "Who is she? Never seen her before. Looks lost already. Bet she doesn't last the month." Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept her head high and continued walking. She had faced worse than curious stares and whispered comments. Much worse. In the main hallway, lined with portraits of distinguished graduates and military heroes, Sarah stopped at the administration office. Behind the desk sat Mrs. Patterson, a stern woman in her 50s who had been managing student affairs at Riverside for over 2 decades. She looked up from her computer screen with the expression of someone who had seen thousands of new students come and go, most of them following predictable patterns. "You must be Sarah Chen," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice crisp and professional. "Welcome to Riverside Military Academy. Here's your class schedule, dormitory assignment, and student handbook." She handed Sarah a manila folder filled with papers. "Your room is in Victoria Hall, 3rd floor, room 312. Your roommate is Amanda Foster. She's been here since freshman year, so she can help you navigate the rules and expectations." Sarah nodded, accepting the folder with both hands in a gesture that seemed almost formal. "Thank you, ma'am. May I ask where I can find the commandant's office?" Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows raised slightly. It was unusual for new students to ask about the commandant on their first day. Most were too nervous or overwhelmed to think about meeting the highest-ranking officer at the academy. "Colonel Harrison's office is on the 2nd floor, but he doesn't typically meet with new students until they've been here at least a week," Mrs. Patterson explained. "Is there something specific you need to discuss with him?" Sarah shook her head politely. "No, ma'am. Just wanted to know for future reference. Thank you for your help." As Sarah left the administration office, Mrs. Patterson watched her go with a puzzled expression. There was something different about this girl, something that didn't quite fit the usual profile of students who arrived at Riverside. Meanwhile, in the senior common room, Marcus and Jake were holding court with their usual group of followers. The room was decorated with military memorabilia and photos of previous graduating classes, creating an atmosphere of tradition and accomplishment. "Did you see the new girl?" Marcus announced to the group. "Looks like she got lost on her way to regular high school." "I heard she's here because her parents couldn't handle her anymore," added Jennifer Walsh, a senior who served as the female cadet captain. "Probably got kicked out of some fancy private school. Or maybe she's one of those rich kids who thinks military school will look good on her college applications," suggested Tommy Burke, another senior. "You know the type, they show up thinking they can buy respect with their parents' money." The group laughed, already forming opinions about Sarah based on nothing more than her appearance and their own assumptions. It was a pattern that repeated itself every year when new students arrived, especially those who joined mid-semester or seemed to come from privileged backgrounds. But, as they continued their speculation, none of them noticed Colonel Harrison walking past the open doorway. He paused for a moment, his weathered face showing the slightest hint of disapproval at the conversation he was overhearing. At 62 years old, with 35 years of military service behind him, Colonel Harrison had learned to read people quickly and accurately. He had also learned that first impressions could be dangerously misleading. Sarah found Victoria Hall without too much difficulty, though she did have to ask for directions twice along the way. The dormitory building was newer than the main academic buildings, with large windows and modern amenities that somehow managed to maintain the military aesthetic of the rest of the campus. Room 312 was halfway down a long hallway lined with identical doors, each bearing the names of its occupants on small plaques. Sarah knocked gently before using her key to enter. The room was typical of military academy housing, sparse but functional, with 2 beds, 2 desks, 2 dressers, and a shared closet. One side of the room was clearly lived in, decorated with photos, ribbons from various competitions, and personal items that spoke of someone who had made this place home. The other side was empty, waiting for Sarah to make it her own. "You must be my new roommate," came a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see a tall, athletic girl with blonde hair pulled back in regulation style. Amanda Foster looked like she had stepped out of a military recruitment poster, confident, capable, and completely at ease in her environment. "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, extending her hand for a handshake. Amanda accepted the handshake with a firm grip. "Amanda Foster. Welcome to Riverside. Fair warning, this place can be pretty intense if you're not used to military structure." "I think I'll manage," Sarah replied quietly, beginning to unpack her few belongings from a single duffel bag. Amanda watched with growing curiosity as Sarah unpacked. Most new students arrived with multiple suitcases filled with personal items, decorations, and enough clothing for every possible occasion. Sarah's possessions fit easily into half of one dresser drawer and took up minimal space in the closet. "Travel light, huh?" Amanda observed. "Habit," Sarah said simply, hanging up 2 identical sets of the academy's daily uniform and one dress uniform that looked like it had been professionally tailored. As Sarah continued unpacking, Amanda noticed something that made her pause. Sarah's movements were precise, economical, and somehow familiar. She folded her clothes with the kind of exactness that came from years of practice, not from reading instruction manuals. When she arranged her personal items on the desk, everything was positioned at perfect right angles with military precision. "Have you been to military school before?" Amanda asked, her tone becoming more respectful. "Something like that," Sarah replied, not offering any additional information. The morning progressed with Sarah attending her first classes, and the whispers and stares continued wherever she went. In American history, taught by Mr. Davidson, a retired Army captain, students turned in their seats to get a better look at the new girl who sat quietly in the back row, taking notes in handwriting that was almost eerily neat. "Miss Chen," Mr. Davidson called out during his lecture on World War II strategy. "Since you're new, why don't you tell us what you think was the most significant factor in the Allied victory in Europe?" The question was clearly meant to put Sarah on the spot, to see how she would handle being the center of attention in her first class. Most new students would stumble through an answer about superior numbers or better equipment, standard responses from their previous history classes. Sarah looked up from her notes, her expression calm and thoughtful. The most significant factor was probably the integration of intelligence gathering with tactical execution, sir. Operations like Ultra, where the Allies could intercept and decode German communications, gave them strategic advantages that numbers alone couldn't provide. But, intelligence is only valuable if you have the command structure and flexibility to act on it quickly. The classroom fell silent. Mr. Davidson's eyebrows rose in surprise, and several students exchanged glances. This wasn't the kind of answer they expected from someone who looked like she had never set foot in a military environment before today. That's an excellent analysis, Miss Chen," Mr. Davidson said, his tone showing newfound respect. "Have you studied military history before?" "A little," Sarah replied, returning her attention to her notes as if the exchange had been perfectly normal. At lunch, Sarah sat alone at a small table near the windows of the dining hall, a vast room with long tables designed to accommodate the academy's 500 students. The dining hall hummed with conversation and the clatter of silverware against plates, but, around Sarah's table, there was a bubble of silence. Students would glance in her direction, whisper to their friends, but no one approached. Marcus and Jake sat with their usual group at what everyone considered the senior table, positioned in the center of the dining hall where they could survey their domain. From there, they watched Sarah eat her lunch in solitude, picking at a salad and reading a paperback book between bites. "Look at her," Jennifer said with a laugh. "Acting like she's too good to talk to anyone. Probably thinks we're all beneath her." "Maybe someone should go over there and give her a reality check," suggested Tommy. "Let her know how things work around here." Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering the idea. As one of the senior leaders, he felt it was his responsibility to maintain the academy's standards and traditions. New students needed to understand their place in the hierarchy, and Sarah's apparent indifference to social dynamics was something that needed to be addressed. "You know what?" Marcus said, standing up. "I think I will go have a chat with our new friend." He walked across the dining hall with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged in this environment. Other students watched with interest, sensing that something was about to happen. Marcus was known for his direct approach to problem solving, and his confrontations with students who didn't meet his standards had become legendary among the student body. Sarah looked up from her book as Marcus approached her table. She marked her place with a napkin and gave him her full attention, her dark eyes calm and steady. "Mind if I sit down?" Marcus asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't really requesting permission. "It's a free country," Sarah replied evenly. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "I'm Marcus Rodriguez, senior class, cadet sergeant. I wanted to welcome you to Riverside and maybe give you some advice about how things work around here." "That's very kind of you," Sarah said, her voice neutral and polite. "See, here's the thing," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone he used when addressing underclassmen who needed correction. "Riverside has traditions, standards, a way of doing things that's been working for over a century. New students sometimes come in thinking they can just do their own thing, but that's not how military life works." "You understand what I'm saying?" Sarah nodded slowly. "You're saying that conformity is important for unit cohesion and that individual behavior reflects on the group as a whole." Marcus blinked, slightly thrown off by her response. He had expected defensiveness, confusion, maybe even tears. Instead, she had summarized his point using military terminology that suggested a deeper understanding than he had anticipated. "Exactly," he said, recovering quickly. "So maybe instead of sitting alone reading books, you should try to integrate with your classmates. Show that you're part of the team." Sarah closed her book and looked directly at Marcus. "And what would you suggest I do to integrate?" "Start by showing some respect for the students who have been here longer," Marcus said, his voice becoming slightly sharper. "Maybe ask questions instead of acting like you already know everything. Show a little humility." "Humility," Sarah repeated, as if she were tasting the word. "Yes, I can see how that would be important in a military environment." Something in her tone made Marcus uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. There was no sarcasm, no defiance, but there was something underneath her polite agreement that felt like she was seeing right through him. "Good," Marcus said, standing up. "I'm glad we understand each other. Welcome to Riverside, Sarah." As he walked back to his table, Marcus felt like the conversation had gone well. He had established the hierarchy, given appropriate guidance to a new student, and done his duty as a senior leader. But something nagged at him, a feeling that he had missed something important in their exchange. Sarah returned to her book, but she was no longer reading. Instead, she was thinking about Marcus, about his friends watching from across the room, about the assumptions they were making and the game they thought they were playing. She had encountered his type many times before, confident, well-intentioned, but limited by their own narrow experience of what strength and leadership looked like. As the lunch period ended and students began clearing their tables, Sarah remained seated for a moment longer. She was thinking about her father, about lessons learned in places where the stakes were much higher than high school social dynamics. She was thinking about the weight of secrets she carried and the reason she had come to Riverside Military Academy. Most of all, she was thinking about how long she could maintain the illusion of being just another struggling new student before the truth became impossible to hide. Because the truth was something that would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone at Riverside who thought they knew what real military bearing looked like. The afternoon brought more classes, more stares, more whispered conversations. In mathematics, taught by Captain Miller, Sarah solved complex equations with an ease that surprised even the instructor. In physical education, led by Sergeant Torres, she completed the fitness assessment with scores that placed her in the top tier, despite her small stature and apparent lack of athletic background. Each class brought new evidence that Sarah Chen was not what she appeared to be, but the other students were too caught up in their preconceptions to notice the accumulating signs. They saw what they expected to see, a privileged girl struggling to adapt to military discipline, and ignored the evidence that contradicted their assumptions. As the day ended and students returned to their dormitories for evening study period, Sarah sat at her desk in room 312, working on assignments that she completed with suspicious efficiency. Amanda watched her roommate with growing curiosity, noting details that others missed, the way Sarah automatically stood whenever an adult entered the room, the precision of her handwriting, the way she organized her study materials with military exactness. "Sarah," Amanda said finally, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah looked up from her chemistry homework, which she had completed in half the time it usually took Amanda. "Of course. Where did you go to school before coming here?" For a moment, Sarah's composed expression flickered, revealing something deeper and more complex than the quiet new girl facade she had maintained all day. "I was homeschooled," she said finally. "My family moved around a lot." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was something Sarah had never shared with anyone outside of a very small circle of people who had security clearances and sworn oaths of secrecy. "Military family?" Amanda pressed, recognizing something familiar in Sarah's bearing. "You could say that," Sarah replied, returning her attention to her homework. Amanda wanted to ask more questions, but something in Sarah's tone suggested that the conversation was over. Instead, she returned to her own studies, though she found it difficult to concentrate. Her new roommate was a puzzle, and Amanda had always been drawn to solving puzzles. Outside their window, the academy grounds were settling into evening quiet. Lights came on in dormitory windows, and the sound of evening formation could be heard from the courtyard below. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle played taps, the mournful notes floating across the campus like a benediction. Sarah paused in her homework to listen to the familiar melody. It was a sound she had heard in many different places, under many different circumstances, but it always reminded her of the same thing: duty, sacrifice, and the weight of responsibilities that most people never had to carry. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, and new opportunities for her classmates to reveal their assumptions about who she was and what she represented. They thought they were dealing with a weak link, a problem to be solved, or a person to be molded into their image of what a military academy student should be. They had no idea that they were actually dealing with someone who had been shaped by forces far more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. Someone who understood military life from a perspective that none of them could even imagine. Someone who was at Riverside not because she needed to learn discipline and leadership, but because she needed to hide from responsibilities that were too heavy for a 17-year-old girl to bear. As the evening wore on and the academy settled into the quiet rhythm of study hour, Sarah continued her homework while around her, the elaborate social hierarchy of Riverside Military Academy continued its familiar patterns. Tomorrow, the real testing would begin. Tomorrow, Marcus and his friends would discover that their assumptions about the quiet new girl were not just wrong, but dangerously, completely, catastrophically wrong. The foundation of everything they thought they knew about leadership, about strength, about what it meant to command respect in a military environment, was about to be challenged by someone who looked like the least threatening person on campus. Someone who carried secrets that could rewrite everything they understood about power and authority. But, tonight, Sarah Chen was just a new girl doing homework in a dormitory room, listening to taps and remembering places and people that her classmates couldn't even imagine existed. The second day at Riverside Military Academy began at 0530 hours with the sharp blast of reveille echoing across the dormitory halls. Sarah was already awake, dressed, and making her bed with corners so sharp they could cut paper when the bugle call sounded. Amanda rolled out of bed with practiced efficiency, but paused when she saw her roommate's already pristine appearance.
"How long have you been up?" Amanda asked, running a brush through her hair.
"A while," Sarah replied, adjusting her uniform tie with movements that seemed automatic.
"I'm an early riser."
What Sarah didn't mention was that she had been awake since 0400, lying in bed and listening to the familiar sounds of a military installation coming to life. The subtle vibrations through the building's structure as staff members arrived, the distant hum of kitchen equipment being started for breakfast preparation, the soft footsteps of night security making their final rounds, these sounds were as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Morning formation took place in the main courtyard, where all students gathered in precise lines according to their company assignments. Sarah found her place in Delta Company, standing among other underclassmen who regarded her with mixtures of curiosity and skepticism. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the faint smell of breakfast cooking in the dining hall. Cadet Colonel Jennifer Walsh called the formation to attention, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. Sarah's response was automatic and perfect, her posture straightened, her arms locked at her sides, her gaze focused directly ahead. But, around her, several students were still shuffling their feet, adjusting their uniforms, or whispering to friends. Delta Company, dress right, called Cadet Lieutenant Morrison, the company commander. The students attempted to align themselves properly, but the line remained uneven. Some students were too close to their neighbors, others too far apart. The spacing was inconsistent, and the overall appearance was sloppy by military standards. Sarah stood perfectly still, her position exactly correct, but she could see the problems around her without moving her eyes. She watched as Morrison grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of precision, his jaw tightening as he barked corrections that seemed to make things worse rather than better.
"This is embarrassing," Morrison muttered under his breath, loud enough for the front rank to hear.
"We look like a bunch of civilians playing dress-up." From her position in formation, Sarah could see Marcus and Jake standing with the senior leadership group near the flagpole. They were watching Delta Company's struggles with expressions of superiority and mild amusement. Marcus said something to Jake that made both of them laugh, and several other seniors joined in their obvious mockery of the underclassmen's performance.
After formation, students filed into the dining hall for breakfast.
Sarah moved through the line efficiently, selecting simple items: scrambled eggs, wheat toast, orange juice. She found an empty table near the back of the hall, opened a book on military history, and began eating while reading. She had barely taken 3 bites when Marcus appeared at her table again, this time accompanied by Jake and Tommy. The 3 seniors arranged themselves around her table with the casual confidence of people who owned the space. "Morning, Sarah," Marcus said, his tone friendly but with an underlying edge.
"How was your first night at Riverside?"
"Fine, thank you," Sarah replied, marking her place in her book but not closing it. Jake leaned forward, his eyes scanning the book's cover.
"Military history? Trying to catch up on stuff you should have learned before coming here?"
"Just interested in the subject," Sarah said calmly.
"What's so interesting about a bunch of old wars?" Tommy asked with a smirk. "It's not like any of that stuff matters anymore."
Sarah looked up at him, her expression mild but somehow penetrating.
"Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Especially the mistakes."
"Oh, we've got a philosopher," Marcus said, exchanging glances with his friends.
"Tell me, philosopher, what do you think about our formation this morning?" Because from where I was standing, Delta Company looked like they'd never seen military bearing in their lives.
The question was clearly a test, designed to see how Sarah would respond to criticism of her classmates and whether she would try to defend them or distance herself from their poor performance. Sarah considered her words carefully.
"I think most people do the best they can with the training and experience they have.
Not everyone has had the same opportunities to develop military bearing."
"Interesting way to put it," Jake said. "So you're saying some people are just naturally better at this than others?"
"I'm saying that competence is usually the result of practice and proper instruction, not natural talent, Sarah replied.
Good leadership can develop anyone's potential.
Marcus felt a flicker of irritation at her response. There was something in her tone that suggested she found their questions simplistic, though her words remained respectful.
And, I suppose you think you could do better? Sarah met his gaze directly. I think there's always room for improvement.
Prove it, Marcus said suddenly, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables.
Delta Company is doing drill practice after classes today. Show us what good leadership looks like. The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down.
Students at surrounding tables had begun to notice the conversation, and word was spreading quickly through the dining hall that something interesting was happening between the seniors and the new girl. Sarah looked around at the faces watching her, seeing excitement and anticipation in their expressions. They were hoping for drama, for conflict, for entertainment. They wanted to see the quiet new girl either rise to the challenge and fail spectacularly, or back down and confirm their assumptions about her weakness. I appreciate the opportunity, Sarah said finally, but I'm not sure it would be appropriate for me to take charge of an activity on only my second day here. Marcus felt a surge of triumph. This was the response he had been hoping for, a polite but clear refusal that would establish her place in the hierarchy and demonstrate that she understood her limitations. Of course, he said, his tone suggesting that her refusal was exactly what he had expected.
Leadership isn't for everyone.
Takes confidence, experience, the ability to command respect.
Can't really learn that from books.
But, as he spoke, Marcus made a mistake. He let too much condescension creep into his voice, too much satisfaction at what he saw as her surrender. Several students nearby heard the exchange, and word began to spread that the new girl had been challenged and backed down. Sarah finished her breakfast in silence while the story grew in the telling. By the time the meal period ended, half the academy had heard that Sarah Chen had been put in her place by Marcus Rodriguez, and that she had admitted she wasn't leadership material. The morning classes passed normally, but Sarah could feel the shift in atmosphere around her. Students who had been merely curious the day before now looked at her with something approaching pity. They saw her as someone who had been tested and found wanting, someone who had confirmed their initial impressions about her inability to handle the rigors of military academy life. In English literature, taught by Professor Martinez, the class was discussing leadership themes in Shakespeare's Henry V. When Professor Martinez asked for examples of effective leadership from the play, several hands shot up. Marcus, Professor Martinez called on the senior who was clearly eager to contribute. Henry's speech before the Battle of Agincourt, Marcus said confidently. He inspired his troops by appealing to their sense of honor and brotherhood. Real leadership is about getting people to follow you into situations where they might not want to go. Professor Martinez nodded approvingly. Excellent analysis. Anyone else? What about you, Miss Chen? Any thoughts on leadership in the play? Sarah felt the attention of the entire class focus on her. She could sense the anticipation in the room, students waiting to see if she would offer some weak, textbook response that would confirm the story spreading about her refusal to take on the drill challenge. I think Henry's most effective leadership moment was actually earlier in the play, Sarah said thoughtfully. When he's disguised as a common soldier, listening to his men's fears and doubts before the battle. Real leadership requires understanding what your people are actually experiencing, not just what you want them to experience. The classroom was quiet for a moment as students processed her response. Professor Martinez looked intrigued. Can you elaborate on that? He asked. Leaders who only surround themselves with people who agree with them tend to lose touch with reality, Sarah continued. Henry's willingness to hear honest feedback, even when it was critical, gave him the information he needed to address his troops' real concerns rather than just assuming he knew what would motivate them. Professor Martinez smiled. That's a sophisticated understanding of leadership psychology. Have you studied management theory? A little, Sarah said, which was becoming her standard response to questions about her background. After class, Amanda caught up with Sarah in the hallway. That was a really good point you made in there, she said. About leaders needing honest feedback. Thank you, Sarah replied as they walked toward their next classes. Can I ask you something?
Amanda said, lowering her voice. Why did you back down from Marcus's challenge this morning? You clearly know more about leadership than most people here.
Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. Sometimes the best leaders know when not to lead, she said finally. It was a cryptic response that left Amanda with more questions than answers, but, before she could ask for clarification, they had reached their respective classrooms. The afternoon brought physical training, held in the Academy's modern gymnasium and outdoor training areas. Sergeant Torres, a former Marine with 20 years of service, put the students through a series of exercises designed to build strength, endurance, and teamwork. Sarah participated without drawing attention to herself, performing each exercise correctly but not exceptionally. She seemed to fade into the background during group activities, unremarkable among her classmates. But Sergeant Torres, with his trained eye for detail, noticed things that the students missed. He noticed that Sarah's form was perfect in every exercise, not the kind of perfect that comes from trying hard, but the kind that comes from muscle memory built through thousands of repetitions. He noticed that she never seemed winded, even during the most demanding activities. He noticed that when other students were struggling with techniques, Sarah would position herself where struggling classmates could observe her form without making it obvious that she was helping them. Most importantly, he noticed that Sarah was deliberately holding back. She was strong enough, fast enough, and skilled enough to excel in every activity, but she was carefully moderating her performance to remain unremarkable. After the PT session, as students were cooling down and preparing to return to the dormitories, Sergeant Torres approached Sarah. "Good form today, Chen," he said casually. "Thank you, Sergeant," Sarah replied. "Where did you train before coming here?" he asked, studying her carefully. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Various places, Sergeant. My family moved around a lot." Sergeant Torres nodded slowly. He had worked with enough military families to recognize the signs, the perfect form that came from professional instruction, the unconscious bearing that spoke of early exposure to military discipline, the careful way she avoided giving specific details about her background. "Military family?" he asked. "Yes, Sergeant." "Active duty?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Yes, Sergeant." Sergeant Torres nodded again, but he didn't push for more information. In his experience, military children who were reluctant to discuss their families usually had good reasons for their reticence. Sometimes those reasons involved classified assignments, dangerous deployments, or family situations that required privacy for security reasons. "Well," he said finally, "if you ever want some extra training, let me know." It's always a pleasure to work with someone who takes fitness seriously. That evening, after dinner and study period, the promised drill practice took place in the main courtyard. Delta Company assembled in their usual sloppy formation while Marcus, Jake, and several other seniors watched from the sidelines. The scene was lit by overhead lights that cast harsh shadows across the concrete, giving the whole proceeding a theatrical quality. Cadet Lieutenant Morrison took charge of the practice session, calling out commands that his classmates executed with varying degrees of competence. The formations were uneven, the timing was off, and the overall appearance was far from the standard expected at a military academy. "This is painful to watch," Jake muttered to Marcus as they observed the struggling underclassmen. "Maybe our new friend Sarah wants to reconsider her decision from this morning," Marcus said loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "Looks like Delta Company could use some of that leadership wisdom she was talking about." Sarah, standing in the formation with her classmates, didn't respond to the taunt. She maintained her position with perfect military bearing while around her, other students shuffled nervously or glanced in her direction to see how she would react. "Shun!" Morrison called out in frustration as the formation fell apart for the third time. "Are you paying attention?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied crisply. "Then, maybe you can explain to your classmates what they're doing wrong, since everyone seems to think you're some kind of expert," Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of sarcasm that drew chuckles from the watching seniors. The courtyard fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment when Sarah would either have to demonstrate her supposed knowledge or admit that she had been pretending to understand things beyond her experience. Sarah looked around at her classmates, seeing embarrassment and resentment in their faces. They were angry at being made to look foolish, angry at being criticized in front of the seniors, angry at the suggestion that someone who had been there for only 2 days might understand something they didn't. "I don't think it's appropriate for me to critique my classmates, sir," Sarah said finally.
The response drew more laughter from the seniors and groans of frustration from her fellow underclassmen.
To them, her refusal looked like another example of backing down, another confirmation that she wasn't willing to step up when challenged.
But Amanda, watching from the edge of the formation, noticed something that others missed.
She noticed that Sarah's refusal hadn't been accompanied by nervousness or embarrassment. Instead, there had been something almost protective in her tone, as if she were trying to shield her classmates from further humiliation rather than avoiding responsibility herself. The drill practice continued for another 30 minutes, with Morrison growing increasingly frustrated and the seniors growing increasingly amused. By the time the session ended, Delta Company looked worse than when they had started, and the story of Sarah's repeated refusals to demonstrate leadership had spread throughout the academy.
As students dispersed to their dormitories, Sarah walked back to Victoria Hall alone.
Behind her, she could hear the conversations of her classmates, their voices carrying clearly in the cool evening air.
"Did you see her just stand there while Morrison was yelling at us?
She talks a big game in class but won't actually do anything when it matters.
I heard she comes from some fancy family.
Probably never had to work for anything in her life. Maybe she should transfer to a regular school where she doesn't have to pretend to be tough." Sarah listened to the comments without changing her expression, but, inside, she felt a familiar weight settling on her shoulders. It was the weight of carrying secrets that couldn't be shared, of maintaining a facade that protected others from truths they weren't ready to handle. Back in room 312, Amanda found Sarah sitting at her desk, working on homework assignments with mechanical precision. The room was quiet except for the scratch of pencil on paper and the distant sounds of other students settling in for the evening. "You know," Amanda said carefully, "I don't think you're what people are saying you are."
Sarah looked up from her chemistry homework. "What are people saying I am?"
"Weak.
Scared. All talk and no action." Amanda sat on her bed, facing Sarah's desk.
"But I don't think that's true."
"Why not?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about her roommate's perspective.
"Because weak people don't stand perfectly still for 30 minutes while people mock them. Scared people don't refuse to throw their classmates under the bus when given the chance. And people who are all talk don't have muscle memory that comes from professional military training."
Sarah's pencil stopped moving. "What do you mean?"
"I mean that I've been at this academy for 3 years, and I've never seen anyone our age with bearing like yours. I mean that your uniforms fit like they were custom tailored by someone who knows military regulations better than anyone here. I mean that you exercise like someone who's been doing PT since childhood, not like someone who learned fitness from high school gym class." The two girls looked at each other across the small room, and, for a moment, Sarah felt the temptation to tell someone the truth. To explain why she was really at Riverside, why she couldn't demonstrate the skills that Amanda had so accurately identified, why maintaining her cover was more important than defending her reputation. But the moment passed, and Sarah returned to her homework. "I think people see what they expect to see," she said quietly. Amanda nodded, understanding that the conversation was over. But, as she prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about her mysterious roommate and the growing certainty that Sarah Chen was hiding something much more significant than a privileged background or academic struggles. Outside their window, the academy settled into its evening routine. Lights went out in dormitory windows, security patrols began their rounds, and the night staff took over the responsibilities of running the institution. Somewhere in the distance, taps played again, its mournful notes floating across the campus like a reminder of duties and sacrifices that most of the students couldn't yet understand. Sarah continued working until well past lights out, completing assignments by the light of a small desk lamp. She worked with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to make the most of limited time, someone who understood that preparation and discipline were the foundations of everything that mattered. As she finally prepared for bed, Sarah allowed herself a moment to think about the day's events. The challenges from Marcus and his friends, the opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities, the pressure from her classmates to prove herself. All of it was exactly what she had expected when she arrived at Riverside. What she hadn't expected was how much it would hurt to be seen as weak and cowardly when those were the two things she had never been. But that pain was part of the price she had to pay for maintaining her cover, for protecting secrets that were bigger than high school reputations and social dynamics. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new opportunities for her classmates to misunderstand who she was and what she represented. The challenges would escalate, the pressure would increase, and, eventually, something would happen that would force her to make a choice between maintaining her cover and protecting the people around her. When that moment came, Sarah knew which choice she would make. The only question was whether anyone at Riverside Military Academy would be prepared for the consequences of learning who she really was. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival at Riverside Military Academy, and the harassment had evolved from casual mockery to deliberate sabotage. What had started as typical hazing for a new student had transformed into something more systematic and cruel, orchestrated by Marcus and his circle of followers who seemed determined to break what they perceived as Sarah's stubborn refusal to acknowledge her place in the academy's hierarchy. The morning of October 15th began like any other, with reveille echoing across the dormitory halls at 0530 hours. But, when Sarah reached for her uniform, she discovered that someone had entered her room during the night and tampered with her belongings. Her dress uniform had been removed from its hanger and thrown into a corner, where it lay wrinkled and dirty. Her regulation shoes had been hidden somewhere in the room, and her class schedule had been torn into pieces and scattered across her desk. Amanda woke to find Sarah calmly gathering the pieces of her schedule, her expression showing no anger or frustration despite the obvious violation of their living space. "Sarah, this is insane," Amanda whispered, looking around their room at the evidence of the break-in. "We have to report this. Someone came into our room while we were sleeping." "It's fine," Sarah replied quietly, smoothing out the pieces of paper and arranging them in order. "I have my schedule memorized anyway." "It's not fine," Amanda protested, her voice rising above a whisper. "This is harassment. It's against academy regulations. Colonel Harrison needs to know about this." Sarah looked up from the papers, her dark eyes calm but somehow sad. "And what would you tell him? That someone moved my things around? That's not exactly a serious crime." "Someone broke into our room, Sarah. They could have done anything. They could have hurt us." "But they didn't," Sarah said, pulling her backup uniform from the closet. "They just wanted to make a point. And reporting it would only make things worse." Amanda watched in frustration as Sarah prepared for the day with the same quiet efficiency she always displayed, showing no outward sign that anything unusual had happened. But Amanda had been watching her roommate carefully over the past 3 weeks, and she had learned to read the subtle signs of stress in Sarah's carefully controlled demeanor. The harassment had started small, accidentally bumping into Sarah in hallways, making loud comments about her appearance or performance when she was within earshot, excluding her from group activities and conversations. But it had escalated steadily as Marcus and his friends became frustrated by Sarah's refusal to react to their provocations. They had expected her to fight back, to complain to the faculty, or to break down under pressure. Instead, she absorbed every insult and every practical joke with the same calm dignity, which only seemed to infuriate them more. At morning formation, Sarah took her place in Delta Company wearing her backup uniform, which was slightly less well-fitted than her dress uniform but still regulation compliant. She stood at perfect attention while around her, several classmates whispered about the obvious signs that someone had interfered with her preparations. Marcus stood with the senior leadership group, watching the formation with obvious satisfaction. When his eyes met Sarah's briefly, he smiled in a way that made it clear he knew exactly what had happened to her uniform and was pleased with the results. But if Marcus expected to see signs of defeat or frustration in Sarah's bearing, he was disappointed. She stood with the same perfect military posture she had displayed from her first day, her gaze focused straight ahead, her expression composed and alert. After formation, during breakfast, the harassment took a new form. As Sarah moved through the serving line, Jake accidentally bumped into her from behind, causing her to spill orange juice on her tray and down the front of her uniform. The collision looked perfectly accidental to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, but Sarah felt the deliberate force behind the contact. Oh, sorry about that, Jake said loudly, his tone suggesting concern while his eyes showed amusement.
Guess you need to watch where you're going.
Several students nearby laughed at the exchange, enjoying the spectacle of the quiet new girl being publicly embarrassed. Sarah simply cleaned up the mess with napkins from the serving line and continued to her table, ignoring the stains on her uniform and the whispered comments following her across the dining hall. But Amanda, who had witnessed the entire exchange, felt her anger building. She had been watching the systematic campaign against her roommate for weeks, and her respect for Sarah's dignified responses had been growing along with her frustration at the unfairness of the situation.
This has gone too far, Amanda muttered to herself as she watched Sarah eat her breakfast while reading, apparently unaffected by the morning's events. The situation reached a crisis point during the afternoon's military history class, taught by Colonel Harrison himself. The commandant rarely taught regular classes, but military history was his passion, and he enjoyed sharing his knowledge with students who showed genuine interest in the subject. The class was discussing the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartan warriors had held off a vastly superior Persian force. Colonel Harrison was explaining the tactical elements of the battle when he decided to test his students' understanding through a practical exercise. "I want you to imagine you're commanding the Spartan force," he said, looking around the classroom. "You're facing impossible odds. Your men are outnumbered 100 to 1. The politicians back home are telling you to negotiate. Your own allies are suggesting retreat. What do you do?" Hands shot up around the classroom as students eagerly offered their opinions.
The discussion was lively, with various students suggesting different tactical approaches, diplomatic solutions, and strategic alternatives. "Miss Chen," Colonel Harrison called, noticing that Sarah had not raised her hand.
"You've been quiet today. What's your assessment of the situation?"
Sarah looked up from her notes, aware that every student in the class was watching her. She could feel the anticipation in the room, her classmates expecting her to offer some weak, textbook response that would confirm their opinions about her capabilities. "I think the question assumes that survival is the primary objective, sir," Sarah said thoughtfully.
Colonel Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "Sometimes the mission is more important than the individual lives involved in completing it."
The Spartans weren't trying to survive the battle, they were trying to buy time for the rest of Greece to prepare its defenses. Their sacrifice was strategic, not just symbolic. The classroom fell silent. Colonel Harrison leaned forward, his expression showing new interest. "Go on," he encouraged. "When you're facing impossible odds, the traditional metrics of success don't apply," Sarah continued.
"You're not measuring victory in terms of territory gained or enemies defeated.
You're measuring it in terms of mission accomplishment, even if that mission requires ultimate sacrifice."
"And how do you maintain morale in a situation like that?" Colonel Harrison asked.
"You don't hide the reality of the situation from your people," Sarah replied. "You tell them exactly what's at stake and why their sacrifice matters."
People can handle the truth, even when it's difficult. What they can't handle is being lied to or manipulated.
Marcus, sitting across the room, felt a surge of irritation at Sarah's response. Here she was again, speaking with authority about leadership and military strategy while refusing to demonstrate any actual leadership when challenged. The disconnect between her academic knowledge and her practical cowardice was becoming increasingly grating.
"That's a very sophisticated analysis," Colonel Harrison said approvingly.
"You've clearly given considerable thought to the psychology of command under extreme circumstances."
"Thank you, sir," Sarah replied simply.
But, as the class continued, Marcus made a decision. He was tired of listening to Sarah speak eloquently about courage and leadership while demonstrating neither quality in her actual behavior. It was time to force the issue, to create a situation where she would have to either step up or be exposed as the fraud he believed her to be. After class, as students filed out of the classroom, Marcus approached Colonel Harrison with what appeared to be a reasonable request. "Sir, I wanted to talk to you about the upcoming field training exercise," Marcus said, his tone respectful and professional.
"What about it, Cadet Rodriguez?"
"Well, sir, we're supposed to be developing leadership skills in the underclassmen, but some of them seem reluctant to take on responsibility." I was wondering if we could structure the exercise to give everyone a chance to demonstrate what they've learned.
Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly.
The field training exercise was a cornerstone of the Academy's leadership development program, designed to place students in challenging outdoor scenarios where they had to apply their theoretical knowledge to practical problems.
That's good thinking, Marcus. What did you have in mind?
Maybe we could assign specific leadership roles to students who haven't had much opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities, Marcus suggested.
Give them a chance to show what they can do under pressure.
It was a cleverly constructed proposal that sounded educational and supportive while actually being designed to set up certain students for public failure. Colonel Harrison, focused on the pedagogical benefits of the suggestion, approved the plan without recognizing its potential for abuse.
Excellent idea, the commandant said.
Work with Captain Williams to identify students who would benefit from leadership challenges. I want this exercise to be a real learning experience for everyone involved.
Marcus left the meeting with satisfaction.
The field training exercise would take place in the mountains outside the city, where students would spend 3 days working through increasingly difficult scenarios designed to test their leadership, teamwork, and problem-solving abilities. It would be the perfect opportunity to put Sarah in a position where her refusal to lead would have real consequences for her classmates.
That evening, the harassment escalated again.
Sarah returned to her room after dinner to find that someone had accessed her computer and deleted all of her completed assignments. 3 weeks of work had vanished, leaving her with impossible deadlines and the prospect of having to explain to her instructors why she had no work to submit. Amanda discovered Sarah sitting at her desk at midnight, working frantically to recreate her deleted assignments. She had been at it for hours, her handwriting becoming increasingly hurried as she tried to complete weeks of work in a single night. "Sarah, you have to report this," Amanda said firmly.
"This isn't a prank anymore. This is sabotage. Someone could get expelled for this."
"I'll manage," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. "You can't manage everything by yourself." Amanda exploded, her frustration finally boiling over. "You're killing yourself trying to rebuild everything they destroyed while they just keep making things worse. Why won't you fight back?"
Sarah's pencil stopped moving.
For a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped, and Amanda saw something raw and complicated in her expression.
"Because some fights aren't worth winning," Sarah said quietly.
"What does that even mean?"
Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering.
"Sometimes fighting back makes things worse for everyone involved.
Sometimes the best thing you can do is absorb the damage and move on. That's not fair to you."
"Fair doesn't matter," Sarah replied, returning to her work. "What matters is keeping the situation from escalating into something that could hurt people." Amanda stared at her roommate, trying to understand the logic behind her passive resistance to increasingly aggressive harassment. There was something in Sarah's tone that suggested she was speaking from experience, as if she had learned these lessons in situations far more serious than high school social dynamics.
"What aren't you telling me?" Amanda asked quietly.
Sarah looked up from her homework, her dark eyes reflecting exhaustion and something deeper, a kind of weariness that seemed too old for someone her age.
"I'm telling you everything I can," Sarah said finally.
The field training exercise began the following Friday afternoon, with buses transporting students to a wilderness area in the mountains 2 hours from the academy. The location was remote and challenging, with dense forests, rocky terrain, and unpredictable weather conditions that would test every aspect of the students' training. Colonel Harrison had divided the students into mixed age groups, each containing seniors, juniors, and underclassmen who were expected to work together under increasingly difficult circumstances. The exercise would last 3 days, with each day presenting new challenges that required different types of leadership and problem-solving skills. Sarah found herself assigned to Group 7, which included Marcus, Jake, Tommy, and 8 other students. The composition was clearly not coincidental. She had been placed in the group most likely to create conflict and least likely to accept her input on any decisions. The first day's challenge was straightforward: navigate to a series of checkpoints using map and compass, collect specific items at each location, and establish a base camp before nightfall. It was a test of basic outdoor skills and group coordination that should have been easily manageable for students with military training.
But, from the beginning, Group 7's dynamics were toxic.
Marcus took charge of navigation, despite the fact that his map reading skills were mediocre at best. Jake assumed responsibility for equipment management but spent more time joking with friends than organizing supplies. Tommy appointed himself the group's spokesman but used his position primarily to make sarcastic comments about other group members' performance. Sarah walked quietly at the back of the group, carrying her full share of equipment and saying nothing as the group missed turns, misidentified landmarks, and fell further behind schedule. She could see exactly where they were going wrong, could have corrected their navigation errors and reorganized their approach to improve efficiency. But every time she opened her mouth to offer suggestions, she was cut off or ignored. "I think we might be going the wrong direction," she said quietly when the group stopped to rest after 2 hours of hiking in circles. "Really?" Marcus replied sarcastically. "And what makes you think that?" Sarah pointed to a distinctive rock formation visible through the trees. "That landmark is marked on the map. If we're heading toward checkpoint 3, it should be to our left, not our right." Marcus glanced at the map, then at the rock formation, then back at the map. His jaw tightened as he realized she was correct, but instead of acknowledging the mistake, he folded the map aggressively and stuffed it into his pack. "I know where we're going," he said firmly. "Just keep walking." But 20 minutes later, the group reached a dead end at a steep cliff that was definitely not marked on their intended route. Other groups had passed them heading in the opposite direction, and the sun was beginning to set earlier than anticipated due to heavy cloud cover. "Great," Jake muttered, looking at the impassable terrain in front of them. "Now what?" "Now we backtrack and try to figure out where we went wrong," Tommy said, his tone showing the first signs of genuine concern. As the group stood at the cliff face, arguing about their options and blame-shifting about who was responsible for their navigation failures, Sarah quietly pulled out her own copy of the map. She had been tracking their route mentally since they left the starting point, noting landmarks and calculating distances as they walked. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely loud enough to carry over the argument. The group ignored her, continuing their debate about whether to backtrack immediately or attempt to find an alternate route around the cliff. "Excuse me," Sarah said again, slightly louder. This time Marcus heard her and turned with obvious annoyance. "What?" "I know where we are," Sarah said simply. "And I know how to get to the next checkpoint before dark." The group fell silent, looking at her with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. For 3 weeks, they had watched her avoid leadership opportunities and refused to take charge when challenged. Now she was claiming she could solve the problem that their designated leaders couldn't handle. "Oh really?" Marcus said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "The girl who won't even speak up during drill practice suddenly knows how to read a map better than people who have been here for 3 years?" "I'm just offering to help," Sarah replied calmly. "Help?" Jake laughed harshly. "Where was this help 2 hours ago when we were asking for input? You've been walking behind us saying nothing while we did all the work, and now you want to jump in and save the day?" Sarah looked around at her group members, seeing frustration, exhaustion, and growing anger in their faces. The sun was setting rapidly, the temperature was dropping, and they were lost in unfamiliar terrain with limited daylight remaining. This was exactly the kind of situation where leadership mattered, where someone had to step up and make decisions that would affect everyone's safety and success. But it was also exactly the kind of situation where her cover would be blown if she demonstrated the full extent of her capabilities. Her navigation skills, developed through years of training in much more challenging environments, would immediately reveal that she was not the inexperienced teenager she pretended to be. "Look," Tommy said, his voice showing signs of panic as darkness began to fall around them. "We need to make a decision. Either someone takes charge and gets us out of here, or we're going to be wandering around these mountains all night." The group looked at Sarah expectantly, waiting to see if she would finally step up when the consequences were real rather than theoretical. This was the moment Marcus had been orchestrating for weeks, a crisis that would force her to either demonstrate leadership or admit that her academic knowledge meant nothing in practical situations. Sarah felt the weight of their stares and the growing urgency of their situation. Every instinct she had developed through years of training told her to take control, to use her skills to ensure the group's safety and mission success. But another part of her mind calculated the cost of revealing herself, the complications that would follow if people started asking questions about where a 17-year-old girl had learned professional-level navigation and survival skills.
Sarah?
Amanda's voice came from somewhere in the group, worried and encouraging. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, weighing her options. When she opened them, she saw not just her group members but also the broader implications of her decision. These were good kids who had made mistakes and were now facing consequences they hadn't anticipated. They didn't deserve to suffer because of their prejudices or her need to maintain cover. "All right," Sarah said quietly, stepping forward and spreading her map on a fallen log.
"If you're willing to listen, I can get us out of here."
Marcus felt a mixture of triumph and skepticism as Sarah began studying the map with an intensity that seemed almost professional. Finally, she was going to have to put her money where her mouth was. Either she would demonstrate that her claims about leadership were legitimate, or she would fail spectacularly and settle the question of her capabilities once and for all. But, as Sarah began explaining their current position and outlining a route to safety, Marcus realized that something was very different from what he had expected. Her voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to come from deep experience rather than nervous bravado. Her analysis of the terrain was detailed and confident. Most unsettling of all, her understanding of tactical movement and risk assessment sounded like it came from someone with professional training. As the group began following Sarah's navigation, moving quickly but safely through terrain that had seemed impassable just minutes earlier, Marcus found himself confronting the possibility that everything he thought he knew about the quiet new girl had been completely wrong.
The question was no longer whether Sarah Chen could lead when forced to do so.
The question was why someone with her obvious capabilities had been hiding them so carefully, and what else she might be hiding that would explain the growing sense that Group 7 had just seen something they were never supposed to witness. The transformation in Group 7's dynamics was immediate and startling. Within 30 minutes of Sarah taking charge of their navigation, they had not only found their way back to the correct route but had also made up significant ground on the other groups. Her leadership style was unlike anything the students had experienced before, quiet, efficient, and somehow managing to make everyone feel competent while accomplishing objectives that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Sarah moved through the darkening forest with a confidence that seemed to illuminate the path for others.
She didn't bark orders or demand attention. Instead, she offered suggestions that somehow became the obvious course of action.
When Jake struggled with his heavy pack, she quietly redistributed weight among group members without making him feel weak. When Tommy began showing signs of altitude sickness, she adjusted their pace and route to minimize elevation changes while still reaching their objectives. Most unsettling for Marcus was the way she handled his wounded pride. Rather than taking obvious control and diminishing his authority, she framed her decisions as implementations of his earlier plans, giving him credit for strategic thinking while taking responsibility for tactical execution. It was a masterful display of leadership psychology that allowed him to save face while ensuring the group's success.
"How much further to checkpoint 4?"
Marcus asked as they paused near a stream to refill water bottles. Sarah consulted her map and compass, but Marcus noticed that she barely glanced at them before answering. She seemed to be navigating primarily from memory and instinct, using the tools as confirmation rather than primary guidance.
"Approximately 2 kilometers northwest," she replied. "We should reach it just before full darkness if we maintain our current pace."
"And the others?"
Jake asked, referring to the items they were supposed to collect at each checkpoint. "We'll have everything on the list," Sarah said confidently.
The checkpoint locations were chosen to provide access to specific resources needed for the next phase of the exercise. Tommy looked up from where he was treating a blister on his foot.
"How do you know all this? I mean, none of us have done this specific exercise before."
Sarah was quiet for a moment, her expression showing the first signs of uncertainty she had displayed since taking charge of the group.
"The setup follows standard training protocols," she said finally.
"Once you understand the logic behind the exercise design, the progression becomes predictable." It was a carefully vague answer that explained nothing while sounding authoritative. But Amanda, who had been watching Sarah closely throughout the afternoon, noticed details that others missed.
She noticed that Sarah's map reading involved identifying landmarks that weren't marked on any map.
She noticed that Sarah's estimates of distance and timing were consistently accurate to a degree that suggested professional training. Most importantly, she noticed that Sarah seemed to be working hard to appear less competent than she actually was, deliberately making small mistakes and asking for confirmation on decisions she was clearly certain about. As they reached checkpoint 4 just as predicted, collecting the required items and establishing camp for the night, the group began to process what they had experienced. Their initial plan had been to use the exercise as an opportunity to expose Sarah's weaknesses and force her to admit her limitations. Instead, they found themselves following someone whose capabilities seemed to exceed those of their designated leaders. While the group set up their shelter and prepared dinner using the supplies they had collected, Marcus found himself studying Sarah with new eyes. Everything about her behavior during the afternoon had contradicted his assumptions about her background and abilities. The way she moved through rough terrain without apparent effort. The way she assessed risks and made decisions with calm efficiency. The way she seemed to anticipate problems before they developed and have solutions ready before anyone else recognized there was an issue. "Sarah," Marcus said as they sat around their small campfire after dinner.
"Can I ask you something?" Sarah looked up from the equipment she was organizing for the next day's activities.
"Of course.
Where did you really learn to do all this?"
He gestured at their perfectly organized campsite, the efficient way she had distributed tasks among group members, the obvious competence she had displayed in handling every aspect of their wilderness survival situation.
"I told you, my family moved around a lot," Sarah replied. "You pick things up." "This isn't stuff you just pick up," Jake interjected. "This is professional level training."
"I know because my dad is career Army, and some of the things you did today are techniques they teach at advanced leadership schools."
Sarah's expression remained calm, but Amanda noticed her hands pause in their organization of equipment.
"People learn different things in different places," Sarah said carefully.
"But, where specifically?" Tommy pressed. "What kind of schools did you attend? What kind of training did you receive?"
"Because this level of competence doesn't come from reading books or taking occasional outdoor education classes." The questions hung in the air around the campfire, and Sarah realized that her careful facade was beginning to crumble. The skills she had displayed during the afternoon were indeed beyond what any normal 17-year-old should possess, even one from a military family. Her navigation techniques, leadership psychology, and wilderness survival capabilities were the result of years of professional instruction from some of the most elite training programs in the world. "Look," Marcus said, his tone showing a new level of respect mixed with growing suspicion.
"We're not trying to interrogate you. But, you've got to understand that what you did today was extraordinary. None of us have seen anything like it from someone our age."
Sarah looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight, seeing curiosity, confusion, and the beginning of real concern. These were good people who had treated her badly based on their assumptions, but who were now trying to understand something that didn't make sense within their frame of reference. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the conversation before Sarah could respond. Colonel Harrison emerged from the darkness, accompanied by Captain Williams and Sergeant Torres. The faculty had been monitoring the groups throughout the day, and Sarah's heart sank as she realized that her performance had probably attracted exactly the kind of attention she had been trying to avoid. "Evening, Group 7, Colonel Harrison said, settling down near their fire.
"Mind if we join you for a few minutes?"
"Of course not, sir," Marcus replied, though his expression showed nervousness at the unexpected visit from senior faculty. Colonel Harrison looked around their campsite, noting the professional-level organization, the efficient use of resources, and the obvious signs that this group had exceeded expectations for the day's activities.
"Impressive work today," he said.
"You made excellent time on the navigation course and your campsite setup is outstanding." "Thank you, sir," Marcus said, though he felt awkward accepting praise for accomplishments that had been primarily due to Sarah's leadership. "I'm curious," Colonel Harrison continued, his gaze settling on Sarah.
"How did you overcome the navigation challenges at Checkpoint 3?
Several groups had significant difficulties with that section. Sarah felt the weight of attention from both her classmates and the faculty members. This was the moment she had been dreading since arriving at Riverside, the moment when her carefully maintained cover story would be tested by someone with the knowledge and experience to recognize inconsistencies. "We worked together as a team, sir," Sarah said carefully. "Everyone contributed their strengths to solve the problems." It was a diplomatically correct answer that avoided claiming personal credit while deflecting the question away from her specific contributions. But Colonel Harrison had been watching Group 7's progress throughout the afternoon, and he had noted details that suggested their success was due to someone with training far beyond the academy curriculum. "Sergeant Torres tells me you have exceptional fitness scores, Miss Chen," Colonel Harrison observed. "And your performance today suggests navigation skills that would be impressive for a graduate of our program, let alone a new student." "I've always enjoyed outdoor activities, sir," Sarah replied. Captain Williams leaned forward, his expression showing professional interest. "What kind of outdoor activities? Scouting? Wilderness programs?" Sarah hesitated for a moment too long before answering. "Family trips, mostly. My father believed in teaching practical skills." The faculty members exchanged glances, communicating something that the students couldn't interpret. But Amanda, watching the interaction carefully, noticed that Sarah's answers were becoming increasingly strained and that she seemed to be working harder to maintain her composed facade. "Well," Colonel Harrison said finally, standing up and brushing dirt off his uniform. "Keep up the good work. Tomorrow's challenges will be more demanding, so make sure everyone gets adequate rest." As the faculty members disappeared back into the darkness, leaving the students alone around their dying fire, the questions that had been building throughout the day could no longer be avoided. "Okay," Marcus said firmly. "I don't know what's going on, but I know that what we saw today wasn't normal." "You're not who you're pretending to be, Sarah, and I think it's time you told us the truth." Sarah stared into the flames, weighing her options. She could continue deflecting, continue offering vague non-answers that avoided revealing anything significant. But the events of the afternoon had made it clear that her cover was becoming unsustainable. Sooner or later, someone would ask the right questions or make the right connections, and the carefully constructed fiction of her background would collapse completely. "I can't tell you everything," Sarah said quietly. "There are things about my family and my background that I'm not allowed to discuss." "Not allowed by whom?" Jake asked. "People who have good reasons for requiring discretion," Sarah replied. Amanda leaned forward, her voice gentle but persistent. "Sarah, we're your friends. We've been living and working together for weeks. Whatever you're hiding, we can handle it." Sarah looked up from the fire, meeting Amanda's eyes across the circle. In them, she saw genuine concern and growing affection, not the suspicion and hostility she had been expecting. Around the fire, she could see similar expressions on the faces of Marcus, Jake, and Tommy, people who had started as adversaries but who were now showing signs of real care about her well-being. "My father is career military," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's not a regular officer. He works in areas that require security clearances and discretion. My family has lived on military installations around the world, often in places where standard educational and recreational opportunities weren't available." "What kind of places?" Marcus asked gently. "Forward operating bases. Diplomatic security assignments. Training facilities for special operations units." Sarah paused, weighing each word carefully. "I received my education from military instructors who were teaching the children of personnel assigned to sensitive positions." The group absorbed this information in silence. It explained many of the inconsistencies they had noticed: her military bearing, her professional level skills, her reluctance to discuss her background. "But that still doesn't explain everything," Tommy said thoughtfully. "The level of competence you displayed today goes beyond what you'd get from living on military bases. This looked like personal training, like someone had specifically prepared you for leadership responsibilities." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as she considered how much truth she could safely reveal. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of sadness that seemed too heavy for someone her age. "My father has been deployed to some very dangerous places over the years.
There were times when standard security protocols weren't sufficient to ensure family safety.
I received additional training because there were situations where I might have had to take care of myself and others if normal protective measures failed. The implications of her words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. They were beginning to understand that Sarah's background involved not just military life but military life at its most extreme and dangerous levels. The skills she had displayed were not recreational abilities but survival capabilities developed because her family's lifestyle had required them.
How dangerous are we talking about? Amanda asked quietly.
Sarah met her roommate's eyes, and, for a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked completely. In that brief instant, Amanda saw exhaustion, loneliness, and a kind of burden that no teenager should have to carry. The kind where you learn to navigate without maps because maps can be captured and used against you. The kind where you learn to lead without drawing attention because leadership makes you a target. The kind where you learn that sometimes the best way to protect people is to let them think you're weak until the moment when being weak will get someone killed. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, sending sparks up into the star-filled sky. Around the circle, Sarah's classmates were processing the reality that the quiet girl they had been tormenting for weeks was actually someone who had grown up in a world where the stakes were life and death rather than social acceptance or academic achievement.
Is that why you wouldn't fight back?
Marcus asked, his voice showing the first signs of real understanding.
When we were giving you a hard time, when people were messing with your stuff, when everyone was calling you weak? Sarah nodded slowly. Fighting back would have meant revealing capabilities that I'm not supposed to have. It would have meant answering questions I'm not allowed to answer. And it would have meant escalating conflicts that could have had consequences none of you were prepared for. What kind of consequences? Jake asked. Sarah looked around the circle again, seeing faces that were no longer hostile or suspicious but concerned and slightly frightened. The kind where people start investigating my background and my family's assignments. The kind where security protocols get activated that affect more than just me. The kind where people I care about might get hurt because I couldn't control my temper in a high school social situation. The weight of her words settled over the group as they began to understand the true complexity of Sarah's situation. She wasn't just a military child trying to fit in at a new school. She was someone carrying secrets that were bigger than anything they had experienced, someone whose very presence at Riverside was probably part of a carefully constructed plan to provide her with something approaching a normal educational experience. So when you came here, Tommy said slowly, you knew you'd have to pretend to be someone you're not?
I knew I'd have to be careful about what I revealed, Sarah replied. This was supposed to be my chance to experience something like normal teenage life. But normal teenagers don't have the kind of training I've received, and they don't carry the kind of responsibilities my family situation requires. Marcus shook his head, looking stunned. And we spent 3 weeks treating you like garbage because we thought you were some spoiled rich kid who couldn't handle real military discipline. You treated me the way you treated me because you made assumptions based on limited information, Sarah said simply.
That's human nature. I don't hold it against you.
But you should, Amanda said fiercely. We were horrible to you. We sabotaged your work, messed with your belongings, made fun of you in front of everyone. You had every right to put us in our places. Sarah smiled slightly, the first genuine smile any of them had seen from her since she arrived at Riverside.
And what would that have accomplished?
You would have felt embarrassed and defensive. I would have revealed more about myself than was safe. And the underlying issues that caused the conflict would still be there, just buried under resentment instead of being worked through honestly.
Is that something they teach in your special training?
Jake asked.
How to handle social conflicts.
They teach you that every action has consequences, and that sometimes accepting short-term discomfort prevents long-term damage, Sarah replied.
They teach you that your ego is less important than your mission.
And they teach you that the strongest response is usually not the most obvious one. The group sat in contemplative silence, processing not just the revelations about Sarah's background but also the implications for their own behavior over the past 3 weeks. They were beginning to understand that they had been testing someone who was operating under constraints they couldn't have imagined, and that her responses had been shaped by training designed for situations far more serious than anything they had ever encountered. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly, her tone suggesting that the most difficult part of the conversation was still to come. The group looked at her expectantly, wondering what other surprises her background might hold. "The reason I'm at Riverside isn't just to get a normal education," Sarah continued. "My father received orders for an assignment that's problematic for family members. The military decided that I needed to be somewhere safe and secure while he's deployed, but also somewhere that would maintain my educational and social development." "What kind of assignment requires that level of family protection?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before responding. "The kind where families become targets simply because of their relationship to the personnel involved. The kind where normal security measures aren't sufficient to ensure safety." The implications were becoming clear. Sarah wasn't just a military child with advanced training, she was someone whose father's work put her in genuine danger, someone who had been placed at Riverside as much for her protection as for her education. "So this whole time," Amanda said softly, "while we were making your life miserable because we thought you weren't tough enough for military school, you were actually here hiding from people who might want to hurt you?" "That's an oversimplification, but not entirely inaccurate," Sarah replied. "And when you wouldn't fight back, when you wouldn't defend yourself, it wasn't because you were weak. It was because fighting back would have compromised your safety?" Sarah nodded. "Among other things. Security sometimes requires accepting treatment that you have the ability to stop, because stopping it would create bigger problems than enduring it." The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long shadows across their faces and creating an atmosphere of intimacy that made the revelations feel even more significant. Around them, the sounds of night in the mountains, wind in the trees, distant calls of nocturnal animals, the murmur of other groups settling in for sleep, provided a backdrop for conversations that were reshaping everything they thought they knew about each other. "What happens now?" Tommy asked. "I mean, we know all this about you. Are we supposed to keep it secret? Are you going to get in trouble for telling us?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "You're not supposed to discuss my background with anyone outside this group. That's for your safety as much as mine. As for whether I'll get in trouble," she shrugged slightly, "that depends on how much attention today's events attracted from people who ask the right kinds of questions." "You mean Colonel Harrison and the other faculty?" Jake asked. "I mean people whose job it is to monitor situations that might compromise security protocols," Sarah replied. "If my performance today was too far outside normal parameters, it might trigger reviews that would be inconvenient for everyone involved." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Are you saying that by forcing you to take charge today, we might have put you in danger?" "I'm saying that maintaining cover is always a balancing act between appearing normal and ensuring safety. Today, safety won." Amanda leaned forward, her expression showing deep concern. "Sarah, we're sorry. Not just for how we treated you, but for putting you in a position where you had to choose between protecting yourself and protecting your cover." "Don't apologize for that," Sarah said firmly. "You made the right decision by insisting that someone take charge when the situation became dangerous. That's exactly what you should do in any leadership scenario. The fact that it complicated my personal situation is my problem to solve, not yours." "But it is our problem now," Marcus said. "Because we know the truth, and because we care about what happens to you. We're a team, and teams protect each other." Sarah looked around the circle of faces, seeing expressions that had transformed completely from the hostility and mockery of just days earlier. Where there had been suspicion and resentment, she now saw concern, respect, and something that looked like the beginning of real friendship. "Thank you," she said simply. "I haven't had many opportunities to be part of a team where personal loyalty mattered more than operational effectiveness." "What do you mean?" Amanda asked. "Most of the teams I've been part of were formed for specific missions with specific objectives. Personal relationships were secondary to getting the job done. This is the first time I've been in a group where people cared about my well-being independently of what I could contribute to group success.
The sadness in her voice made clear how much she had been missing that kind of connection, and how difficult it had been to maintain her facade when what she really needed was exactly what was happening around the campfire: honest conversation with people who knew her real situation and accepted her anyway. "Well, you're stuck with us now," Jake said with a grin. "No matter what happens with the security reviews or operational complications or whatever. You're part of Group 7, and we take care of our own." Sarah smiled again, more broadly this time. "I'd like that. It might be complicated, and it might require some adjustments to how we handle certain situations, but I'd like to be part of something where personal relationships matter." As the group began preparing for sleep, spreading out sleeping bags around the dying fire and organizing equipment for the next day's activities, the atmosphere had changed completely. Where there had been tension and conflict just hours earlier, there was now a sense of unity and mutual protection that went far beyond anything required by the training exercise. But, as Sarah settled into her sleeping bag, looking up at the stars through the clear mountain air, she couldn't shake the feeling that the day's revelations had set in motion a chain of events that would be difficult to control. Colonel Harrison's questions had been too pointed, her performance had been too exceptional, and the faculty's interest had been too focused for the situation to pass unnoticed. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the quiet sounds of the other groups settling in for the night, unaware that Group 7 had just shared secrets that could reshape the entire dynamic at Riverside Military Academy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges from the exercise, but also new complications from the growing likelihood that her carefully maintained cover was about to be blown completely. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah found herself thinking about her father, wondering if he would approve of her decision to trust her classmates with partial truth about their situation. She thought about the trade-offs between security and connection, between protection and authenticity, between the mission requirements that had shaped her life and the personal relationships that might finally make that life worth living. Most of all, she thought about the fact that for the first time since arriving at Riverside, she didn't feel alone. Whatever complications were coming, whatever reviews and investigations and security protocols might be triggered by the day's events, she would face them with the support of people who knew her real situation and had chosen to stand with her anyway. The mountains around them held secrets of their own, geological stories written in stone, ecological relationships invisible to casual observation, weather patterns that could change without warning. But tonight, Group 7 had added their own secrets to the mountain's collection, bonds forged in firelight and truth that would prove stronger than any of them could have imagined when the sun had risen on what they thought would be just another training exercise. Tomorrow would test not just their survival skills and leadership capabilities, but also their ability to maintain the trust they had built while navigating the complicated realities of Sarah's situation. The real question was whether the connections they had forged would be strong enough to survive the scrutiny that was almost certainly coming their way. The second day of the field exercise began before dawn with an emergency that would test everything Group 7 had learned about trust, leadership, and the complicated realities of Sarah's situation. At 0430 hours, while the mountains were still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, the sharp blast of an emergency whistle cut through the quiet of their campsite. Sarah was awake instantly, her training kicking in with automatic precision. Around her, the others stirred with varying degrees of alertness, but she was already on her feet, scanning the darkness for signs of the problem that had triggered the alarm. "What's happening?" Marcus mumbled, struggling out of his sleeping bag. Before Sarah could answer, the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, followed by Captain Williams jogging into their campsite. His expression was grim, and, behind him, Sarah could see other faculty members moving between the scattered group campsites with obvious urgency. "Group 7, I need everyone awake and ready to move in 5 minutes, Captain Williams announced. "We have a situation." The group scrambled to their feet, pulling on boots and jackets while trying to shake off the disorientation of being awakened from deep sleep. But Sarah was moving with a different kind of efficiency, packing essential equipment with practiced speed while her eyes tracked the movement of faculty members and the distant sounds of other groups being awakened. "What kind of situation, sir?" Marcus asked, asserting his role as the group's designated leader. Captain Williams paused, his gaze settling on Sarah with an intensity that made her stomach clench. "Group 3 missed their last 2 radio check-ins. Their emergency beacon activated about an hour ago from a location approximately 8 kilometers northeast of here. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, and
we need all available personnel to assist with search and rescue operations." The words hit the group like a physical blow. Group 3 included several of their friends and classmates, led by Jennifer Walshant, including Amanda's roommate from the previous year. The emergency beacon meant that someone was injured, lost, or both, and the mention of deteriorating weather conditions added urgency to an already dangerous situation. "What do you need us to do?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the shocked silence of her classmates. Captain Williams looked at her with an expression that seemed to contain knowledge beyond what the situation required. "The terrain between here and Group 3's last known position is extremely challenging. We need teams with advanced navigation skills and wilderness survival capabilities to cover ground quickly and safely." There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't a random assignment, that Group 7 had been selected for specific reasons that went beyond their performance in the previous day's exercises. "Sir," Marcus said, struggling to assert authority in a situation that was rapidly moving beyond anything their training had prepared them for. "What are our specific orders?" "You'll be working with search and rescue coordinators who are en route from the county sheriff's department," Captain Williams replied. "Your job is to provide local knowledge and additional manpower while professional rescue teams handle the technical aspects of the operation." But, as he spoke, Captain Williams continued to focus his attention on Sarah, and she realized with growing certainty that the faculty knew more about her background than they had previously revealed. The emergency might be real, but her inclusion in the response team was probably not coincidental. "Group 7 will be partnered with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, who has extensive search and rescue experience," Captain Williams continued. "He'll brief you on the specific mission parameters." Sarah felt her blood turn cold at the mention of Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. She recognized the name from briefings her father had shared about personnel assignments to sensitive operations. If Morrison was here, it meant that someone with connections to special operations had taken an interest in the situation at Riverside Military Academy. As Captain Williams jogged away to brief the next group, Sarah's classmates turned to her with expressions that mixed excitement about the rescue operation with growing awareness that something bigger was happening than they understood. "This feels like more than a training exercise," Amanda said quietly. "Because it is," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a note of resignation. "The emergency is real, but the response is being structured around objectives that go beyond just finding Group 3. "What do you mean?" Jake asked. Sarah was checking her equipment with movements that seemed automatic and professional. "I mean that Lieutenant Colonel Morrison doesn't get called out for routine search and rescue operations involving high school students. His presence here means that someone decided this situation was an opportunity to evaluate capabilities that aren't part of the normal academy curriculum." Marcus felt a chill of understanding. "They're testing you. This whole thing is a test." "Testing me, evaluating the security implications of my presence here, determining whether recent events have compromised operational security protocols." Sarah's voice was calm, but her expression showed the strain of maintaining composure under circumstances that were spiraling beyond her control. "The emergency is real and our classmates need help. But, yes, this is also very definitely a test." Before anyone could respond, the sound of helicopter rotors began echoing off the mountain walls. In the growing light of dawn, they could see military aircraft approaching from the south, not the civilian rescue helicopters they might have expected, but clearly military hardware that suggested a much more sophisticated response than a local emergency would typically warrant. "Those aren't county rescue birds," Tommy observed, his voice showing the same growing unease that all of them were feeling. "No," Sarah agreed, watching the helicopters settle into a clearing about half a kilometer from their position. "They're not." Within 20 minutes, Group 7 found themselves part of a search and rescue operation that bore no resemblance to anything they had experienced in their academy training. The command post that had been established looked like something from a military operation, with communication equipment, tactical displays, and personnel who moved with the precision of professional soldiers rather than civilian emergency responders. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was exactly what Sarah had expected, a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone who had commanded troops in combat situations and the kind of focused intensity that came from years of operations where lives depended on split-second decisions. "Group 7, Morrison said as they approached his position near the command post.
I understand you performed exceptionally well in yesterday's navigation exercises.
We worked well as a team, sir, Marcus replied, though his voice showed uncertainty about his role in this new environment. Morrison's gaze settled on Sarah with the same focused attention she had received from Captain Williams.
Miss Chen, I've reviewed your performance reports.
Your navigation and leadership capabilities are impressive for someone your age. Sarah felt the weight of her classmates' attention as they realized that Morrison already knew details about her background that went beyond what any academy instructor should have access to.
Thank you, sir, Sarah replied carefully.
I'd like you to take point on the navigation for this mission, Morrison continued. The terrain is challenging, and your demonstrated capabilities make you the logical choice for that responsibility. The words hung in the air like a challenge and a trap simultaneously. Sarah understood that accepting the assignment would mean revealing more of her training than she had ever intended to show, but refusing would mean potentially compromising the safety of her missing classmates. Around her, Marcus, Jake, Tommy, and Amanda watched with growing understanding of the impossible position she was being placed in. They had learned enough about her situation the previous evening to recognize that this was exactly the kind of scenario she had been trying to avoid, being forced to demonstrate capabilities that would raise questions she couldn't answer safely. Sir, Marcus said, stepping forward with newfound courage. Group 7 has been working as a team throughout this exercise. We'd prefer to continue operating that way, with shared responsibilities rather than individual assignments. Morrison looked at Marcus with mild surprise, clearly not expecting pushback from a teenage cadet on operational assignments.
This isn't a democracy, son.
This is a rescue mission where every minute counts and where the best qualified personnel need to be in positions where they can do the most good.
With respect, sir, Amanda added, moving to stand beside Marcus. Sarah's navigation skills are part of our team capabilities. We've learned to work together, and splitting up our established dynamics might actually reduce our effectiveness.
Sarah looked at her classmates with surprise and growing emotion as she realized they were trying to protect her, trying to provide her with cover that would allow her to contribute without being singled out for individual attention. That's an interesting perspective, Morrison said, his tone suggesting that their defense of Sarah was exactly what he had been hoping to observe.
Very well.
Group 7 will operate as a team, with Miss Chen providing navigation support within your existing leadership structure. As they received their mission briefing and prepared to move out toward Group 3's last known position, Sarah realized that the test was more complex than she had initially understood. Morrison wasn't just evaluating her individual capabilities, he was assessing the group dynamics that had developed around her, the loyalty and protective instincts her classmates had developed, and the way they had adapted to working with someone whose background exceeded their own experience. The search operation that followed was unlike anything any of them had experienced before. Moving through terrain that was genuinely challenging, under time pressure created by both the missing students and deteriorating weather conditions, Group 7 found themselves working at a level of intensity and coordination that exceeded anything from their academy training. Sarah guided them through the mountains with a precision that left no doubt about her professional-level training, but her classmates provided support, communication, and tactical thinking that allowed her to focus on navigation while they handled other critical aspects of the mission. Marcus coordinated with the other search teams, Amanda managed their communications equipment, Jake handled logistics and supply management, and Tommy served as their medical specialist. They moved as a true team, each member contributing their strengths while covering for others' limitations, creating a collective capability that was greater than the sum of their individual parts. When they finally located Group 3, they cold, exhausted, and dealing with a sprained ankle that had slowed their movement, the rescue operation showcased everything they had learned about leadership, teamwork, and mutual support under pressure. But, as they helped their classmates prepare for evacuation and began the careful journey back toward the main base camp, Sarah noticed Morrison and other personnel watching their operation with the kind of focused attention that suggested detailed analysis rather than routine observation.
Sarah, Amanda said quietly as they paused to rest during the return journey. Whatever this was really about, I think you passed.
We passed, Sarah corrected, looking around at her teammates with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper.
We all passed.
The debriefing that followed their return to base camp confirmed Sarah's suspicions about the true nature of the day's events. Morrison interviewed each member of Group 7 individually, asking detailed questions about their teamwork, decision-making processes, and the way they had adapted to working under pressure. When it was Sarah's turn, Morrison's questions became more specific and more pointed. Your navigation skills are consistent with advanced military training, Morrison observed. Your leadership style shows influences from multiple tactical doctrine schools. Your group integration capabilities suggest experience with diverse team dynamics under stress. Sarah sat quietly, waiting to see where the questions were leading. Most importantly, Morrison continued, your teammates have developed protective instincts regarding your welfare that go beyond normal peer relationships. They've recognized that you have capabilities that exceed their experience, and they've adapted their own behavior to provide you with operational security. They're good people, Sarah said simply. Yes, they are. The question is whether their protective instincts are based on friendship or on an understanding of your actual situation. Sarah met Morrison's gaze directly. I think they understand enough to know that some things require discretion without needing to know all the specific details. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of understanding that suggests your integration here has been more successful than initially anticipated. The final revelation came that evening, as the students were preparing to return to the academy. Colonel Harrison called Sarah aside for a private conversation that would explain the real reasons for the elaborate testing she had undergone. Miss Chen, Colonel Harrison said as they walked away from the main group. I think it's time you and I had an honest conversation about why you're really at Riverside. Sarah felt her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack. Sir? Your father is Lieutenant General Chen of Special Operations Command. You've spent most of your life on classified installations, receiving training that most professional soldiers never access. You were placed at Riverside not just for your safety, but because certain people wanted to see how well you could integrate with peers who didn't share your background. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about how much the faculty knew about her situation. The past 3 weeks have been a comprehensive evaluation of your social adaptation, stress response, and team integration capabilities, Colonel Harrison continued. Today's exercise was designed to test whether you could operate effectively when forced to reveal aspects of your training, and whether your classmates would provide appropriate operational security without being briefed on the sensitive nature of your background. Sarah stared at him, processing the implications of what she was hearing. The entire situation was orchestrated? The emergency was real. Your classmates' danger was real. But the response protocols were designed to create a controlled environment where your capabilities could be evaluated without compromising security classifications. And the result? Colonel Harrison smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Sarah had seen from him since arriving at Riverside. The result is that you've demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptation and team integration that your father hoped you would achieve. More importantly, you've developed relationships with peers who can provide you with something approaching normal social development while maintaining appropriate discretion about sensitive matters. As they walked back toward the group, Colonel Harrison continued. Your classmates have been briefed on the need for discretion regarding certain aspects of your background. They understand that some things about your family and training require security considerations without needing to know specific classifications or operational details. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and lingering concern. What happens now? Now you get to experience something that's been missing from your life, genuine friendships with people who know enough about your real situation to support you authentically, but who are primarily interested in your welfare as a person rather than your capabilities as an asset. As they rejoined Group 7, Sarah saw her classmates watching her with expressions that confirmed Colonel Harrison's words. They had been told enough to understand the general nature of her situation without being burdened with details that would compromise security or put them at risk. Marcus approached first, his expression serious but warm. So, he said quietly. I guess we know now why you've been so patient with our stupidity for the past 3 weeks. You weren't stupid, Sarah replied. You were normal teenagers reacting normally to someone who wasn't what she appeared to be. Well, we're not normal teenagers anymore, Amanda added with a grin. We're normal teenagers who happen to be friends with someone extraordinary, and we're okay with that. Jake nodded agreement.
Besides, someone has to keep you grounded and make sure you don't get too serious all the time. And someone has to make sure nobody else gives you grief about anything, Tommy added. Because now we know you could probably handle yourself, but we'd rather handle it for you. Sarah looked around at her friends, people who had started as tormentors and had become something she had never expected to find, a group that knew her real situation and accepted her anyway, people who would provide both support and cover as she navigated the complicated balance between her extraordinary background and her desire for normal human connections. The bus ride back to Riverside Military Academy was subdued, with students processing both the successful rescue operation and the various revelations about group dynamics that had emerged during the exercise. But, for Group 7, the conversation was different, focused on plans for the future and the logistics of maintaining friendships that would have to navigate unusual security considerations. As they approached the academy gates, Sarah felt a sense of possibility that had been missing since her arrival. For the first time in her life, she had friends who knew enough about her real situation to support her authentically, mentors who understood her background and could help her develop normally despite her unusual training, and a place where she could experience something approaching normal teenage life. The challenges weren't over. Maintaining security protocols while building genuine relationships would require constant attention and careful communication. But the foundation had been established for something she had never expected to have, a life where her extraordinary capabilities could coexist with normal human connections. That night, back in room 312, Sarah and Amanda talked late into the evening about the day's revelations and the changes they would bring to their friendship. So, Amanda said as they prepared for bed, "Tomorrow we go back to normal classes and regular academy life. Except now I know my roommate could probably navigate us out of any wilderness situation, handle most emergency scenarios, and has been trained by people I'll probably never meet for reasons I'll probably never fully understand." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying a lightness that had been missing from her voice for weeks. "And now I know that my roommate and classmates are the kind of people who will stand up for someone even when they don't fully understand the situation, who can keep important secrets without being asked, and who judge people based on character rather than capabilities." "It's going to be an interesting year," Amanda observed. "It's going to be the first normal year I've ever had," Sarah replied. "And I couldn't have asked for better people to share it with." Outside their window, the academy settled into its familiar evening routines, but with new undercurrents of understanding and connection that would reshape the social dynamics for everyone who had been touched by the events of the past few days. Group 7 had become something more than a collection of students thrown together by chance. They had become a family bound by shared secrets, mutual respect, and the kind of loyalty that emerges when people choose to stand together despite complicated circumstances. For Sarah Chen, the girl who had learned to command troops before she learned to make friends, it was the beginning of a life where her extraordinary background could coexist with the normal human connection she had always wanted but never thought she could have. And, for her classmates, it was the beginning of a friendship with someone whose quiet strength and hidden capabilities would teach them new definitions of courage, loyalty, and what it really meant to command respect through character rather than authority. The Academy's motto, carved in stone above the main entrance, spoke of honor, duty, and service. But, for Group 7, those words now carried personal meaning beyond anything they had understood when they first walked through Riverside's gates. They had learned that true leadership emerges from trust and mutual support, that real strength often appears as gentleness, and that the most powerful command authority comes not from rank or training, but from the willing loyalty of people who choose to follow because they believe in both the mission and the person asking them to share it.